Good morning to each and every one of you, and welcome as the National Black Faith Coalition Against Human Trafficking has come together, and we have an outstanding presenter today in the person of Dr. Brenda Ingram, who will present on trauma this morning and its effects on the Black boys. I'm not going to go into any more details. That'll be given to you in the introduction. And as we move forward right now, I'd like to invite Pastor Howard to come forth and open us up in prayer.
Let's pray. Father, we are grateful for this day, and we gather in your name, your holy name, as the National Black Coalition Against Human Trafficking. We confess, Lord, that we are powerless without your help, your wisdom, love, and might. Powerless to make a difference in the lives of those who are affected by this evil, physically, emotionally, and spiritually pandemic within our communities and the world that we live in. Please bless our efforts, this program, our presenter, Dr. Brenda Ingram, each participant here, and all who are a part of the struggle against human trafficking, that souls will be saved and lives changed for your glory and honor. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Howard, for that powerful prayer. For those of you who may not know who I am, I'm Pastor Oliver E. Bowie, and I'm a part of the National Black Faith Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And as we have come together today, I'd just like to share a few things with you. Number one, I want to let you know that the National Black Faith Coalition is a faith coalition powered by faith. We believe that in order to win this fight, we must put God first. And as we put God first, that means that God's people must be active in order to win this fight. And so what I'm saying is that we need to have the church, and specifically the Black church, taking a lead role in this fight against human trafficking if we intend to win. Now, that does not mean that we're just limited to just the Black Faith Coalition, but this is a coalition that reaches out to everyone, because we know that we need everyone to fight, but we are taking on that specific fight in the Black community, which is so greatly impacted by this great evil. We also realize that one of the things, if we're going to win this fight, that we must restore and rebuild the Black family. Reason why why this evil of human trafficking has been able to run rampant within our community is because our families have been broken down. And so one of the things that we want to focus in on is rebuilding and strengthening the Black family. And through that, and as we go through that, and as we go through the church, and last but far from least, because it's number one, and as we trust and believe God, how many of you know that we cannot lose this fight? I don't want to belabor you with a whole lot of talk at this time. At this time, I just want to thank you, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you, and I'm looking forward to our presenter who will present on trauma. That will be the main focus, because you know that there are many different areas that you have to address in this fight. This is just one, and we will focus on that today, and we will give you time to ask questions toward the end. At this time, we will have Susan Patterson come forth at this time and share with us a few things, and then I'll introduce those who are part of the Black Faith Coalition. Thank you.
So, yeah, I'm just going to take 1 minute to give you a brief overview of how we're structured, which is today you're with the National Black Faith Coalition Against Human Trafficking. I'm one of the core group members. I head up the National Faith Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And our next meeting is June 12th, and the subject will be engaging men. And we have some really powerful national leaders who will be part of that panel, like Patrick Nave from Florida, who heads up Christian Bikers Against Trafficking, and a speaker from Wisconsin representing Hamad, a faith-based group that's gotten 45,000 men to take the pledge against trafficking. When I've worked with a lot of churches, and what I found is having them hesitate from starting something is they don't feel they know enough. So I started this YouTube channel, which is going to have about 16 training videos so that people can watch those and feel confident to start something. Also at the YouTube channel is going to be people who have made a huge contribution to the end of trafficking. So for instance, if you wanted to start a home for survivors at your church, you could contact Karina. If you wanted to start a ministry to bring Jesus to the pimps, you would contact Reverend Gail Oliver and watch his video. We also have work groups, which are discussion groups. We have one on advocacy, engaging men, people who are active in their church ministries. We have some future ones. And I'm not going to go into detail on any of this because all the detail can be found at this website. And I'll put the link for that in the chat.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that information. And as we continue to move forward, I'd like to introduce each and every one of you and just wave your hand and say hi when I call your name, okay? And thank you. These are the great individuals that has been blessed and come together for the National Black Faith Coalition to join in this great fight. So as I call your name, I want you to raise your hand and say hi. All right, the first person I'd like to introduce is Karen Coleman. Karen brings 22 years experience to this issue, and we are fortunate to have her. Say hi to everyone there, Karen.
Hello, hi.
Who's absent, but I'd call his name so he won't say hi, Mr. Arthur Scott. And we do have present, and Sheila Thomas, who will say hi after I get through, are our advocacy experts who will be hosting a work group on effective advocacy at the level of local government. Sheila, say hi.
Good morning, hello.
All right. Also, we have Melinda Metz, who is the executive director for Alive, a Houston nonprofit that is ending human trafficking and exploitation in the Black community through events. Melinda, say hi. All right. Okay. All right. Also, I'd like to introduce Delman Howard, a pastor of an African-American Episcopal church, a denomination that has taken on human trafficking in a big way. Pastor Howard.
Good morning. Hello.
All right. And then we also have Mr. Isaac McKeithen. He heads up an outreach for men in partnership with the EPIC group. And we will hear more about that later. Isaacs.
Good morning, everyone.
All right. And we also have Jenna Blannon, who I can say personally is my right-hand person, and thank God for her. She has worked in outreach as a chairperson for a church and is currently assisting me. Praise the Lord. Say hi to everyone, Jennifer.
Good morning. Good morning.
And last but far from least, we have Bishop Gail Oliver, who is the pastor of the Greater Light Church in Santa Ana and has a ministry to pimps. Greet the wonderful people there, Bishop. All right, Bishop. All right, okay. Well, let me say at this time, I'd like to invite one of our also members of the Black Faith Coalition, our brother Ken Henry, who will also at this time introduce our speaker. Brother Ken Henry, please.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure today to introduce this amazing woman, phenomenal, brilliant mind, Dr. Brenda Ingram. And I'm going to read you guys her background because I think it's very, very imperative to know. And Dr. Ingram has worked with us over in Los Angeles. She's presented a couple of times at different events that I've hosted, especially the Compton Human Trafficking Task Force. And so what you guys are going to hear today is something that I have heard her do before that is still relevant, very, very relevant, probably more than ever now. And we're so grateful that she's able to join us today to bless us with this. So without further ado, we're going to get right into this. Let me give you guys a little bit about who she is, because I think it's very, very important that you know who you're giving your time to. Dr. Brenda Ingram is a licensed clinical social worker and an educator who has served over 30 years working in trauma, mental health, and education fields. Her dissertation focused on the impact of community violence on the academic careers of African-American elementary school students. She's a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Keck School of Medicine of USC, Associate Director, Student Counseling and Mental Health Division, USC Student Health, Associate Director, USC Student Counseling and Mental Health, and Program Director, Relationships and Sexual Violence Prevention and Services at USC Student Health. And Dr. Ingram was a lecturer with UCLA and CSU Long Beach social work departments and a full-time adjunct professor and member of the Pacific Oaks College Marriage and Family Therapy, where she developed their specialization for African-American mental health. She's on the advisory board of the African-American Communities Public Health Coalition. She's a member of the National Association of Social Work and National Association of Black Social Workers. She was the co-chair of the Trauma Informed Los Angeles Steering Committee. Dr. Ingram received her doctorate of education from the University of Phoenix, a master's of social work from California State University of Sacramento, and a bachelor's in arts and psychology from UCLA. She provides consultations, program development, workshops, and training on sexual domestic violence, trauma, and trauma-informed care, cultural competency to various human service agencies, schools, mental health professionals. So guys, as you can see, we come here very, very quick. We are very intentional about who we have presenting and the topics that we talk about. And so without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to this lady so she could bless us today. Dr. Ingram, welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This presentation is on the intersection of risk factors for Black boys as sex traffickers as well as victims. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is an issue that impacts the Black community in a very, very significant way. And so probably a few years ago, I started talking about sex trafficking. My background, again, as Ken mentioned, is in trauma, and in particular sexual trauma. So I've worked a lot with children who have been victimized and then have been able to sort of watch that developmental trajectory, if you will, into adulthood and recognize that many of these children who do not receive care at very vital points in their life can end up being trapped in situations that put them at even greater risk. And so what we're going to talk about is that we're going to look at some of these risk factors, because a lot of people don't really talk about boys or Black boys and what happens to them in relationship to sex trafficking. And so for many of you, this may be the first time you've really talked about boys. And again, I think it's important to keep in mind that even though the numbers tell us one thing, we want to look for the backstory. It tells us a whole nother issue. So I'm going to go ahead and start. At least I think I am. Let me just make sure I get down here. Okay. So first I just want to, and again, obviously this is a very knowledgeable group about human trafficking, so I don't need to talk a lot about it, but I do want to make some distinctions. And so again, we sort of talk about human trafficking as a whole phenomena, but again, human trafficking includes labor trafficking and sex trafficking as well. And so my focus for this particular presentation is going to be on sex trafficking. And again, this impacts every community in our nation as well as around the world. It's an insidious threat. It's difficult for folks to track because, again, it can be so undercover, yet out in broad daylight, if you will. And again, it's very hard to dismantle because there's so many parts attached to it. So again, most people tend to think of human trafficking as being this sort of international phenomena where we have these international criminals targeting victims in developing worlds. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a very common situation here in the US of A. It is not just outside, it is inside as well. And so it's important to keep in mind that this issue of human or sex trafficking can be traced back to the settling of America. It's part of the fabric of America, starting with the colonization of Native peoples, forcing them into different types of servitude or just outright genocide. Also connected to the history of slavery of African Americans, and we'll talk more about that. Also about the exploitation of migrant and immigrant labor that we see. One of the largest types of trafficking is also labor trafficking, where folks are brought in to provide pretty much free labor in terms of household chores, in terms of other types of factories and things of that nature. And so we know that there's different types of this trafficking. And it's all exploitative. And again, it goes back to our history of how we settled in America here. And so again, for sex trafficking, it pretty much started with the selling of indigenous women and children for sexual purposes. And again, this has been going on since the colonial time. There's evidence that the early British surveyors and settlers viewed Native women's sexual and reproductive freedom as a proof of their innate impurity. And that many assume the right to kidnap, rape, and prostitute Native women and girls without consequence. And to this day, Indigenous folks, Native Americans have some of the highest rates of victimization around these issues. A lot of it has to do with how the law is situated. And so most crimes or most violent crimes of a sexual nature happen within communities. The perpetrators look like the victims. When it comes to Indigenous people in America, the victims look very different than the perpetrators. It's one of the places where the vast majority of women and children who are victimized by sexual assault or abuse is done by those who are outside of the community. And that's a phenomenon that we really need to acknowledge. And again, it has to do with how laws are written, and that Native communities can't charge folks who are not part of that community or part of that nation. And so it becomes a very feeding grounds or hunting grounds, if you will, for people who are not part of the Native. And so again, this history of exploitation of people of color contributes to the high rate of sexual victimization, sexual trafficking, as well as human trafficking. And so let's talk a little bit about sex trafficking in the Black community. Again, it's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise involving millions and millions of people. And so again, it's important to keep in mind that most victims are females of color. Again, Asian, African, African-American, Latinas. Sex trafficking victims are overwhelmingly female, about 94%, but it's also, we need to keep in mind that a lot of males are also trafficked, especially young men, especially men who are of the LGBTQ community, are exploited. We see that because they end up being sort of thrown away folks. And so they end up being picked up by traffickers. Traffickers live based on vulnerabilities. And the more vulnerability someone has, the more likely they're going to be exploited. So again, about 13% of confirmed sex trafficking victims are 25 years of age or older. So that means that a significant number are younger than that. Members of a minority subgroup reported entering prostitution at an age approximately 2.5 years younger than members of the white subgroup. And for African-American girls, they enter sex trafficking at a younger age, at about 11, where the average age might be around 13. For African-Americans, it's around 11 years of age. And so African-American girls are being pulled into sex trafficking at much younger ages. I remember I went on a call when I was an advocate for a rape crisis center, and the young lady that I went to talk to was 11 years old. And she had been trafficked probably for about maybe at least a couple of years. So that means around 9 years of age. And again, she was in foster care. And it wasn't like, you know, someone was holding her against her will in some abandoned house. She was a foster child and she ran away often. She had a pimp, and he kept her imprisoned by drugs and alcohol. And I found, and when I came in contact with her, she was in the hospital having been gang raped. And it was a very interesting response at that time. It was before we were really talking about sex trafficking and victims related to that. And so law enforcement was treating this child, and I do mean child, as if she were a grown woman who was making a decision to be a prostitute. And they denigrated her, they treated her less than human. They said she's just out here trying to make some money. And I'm like, how does an 11-year-old end up with that sort of narrative for her life? That she was a victim and that law enforcement did not see her as a victim was very disheartening. And I was so upset by how the officers were responding to her that I had to go and talk to the watch commander because I thought this was ridiculous that they were treating her as a criminal. And then somewhere along the line that changed, and we can talk about that a little bit later. When the victims were decolorized, all of a sudden we started talking about sex trafficking in a very different way. So it's important to keep in mind that sex trafficking victims, about 83% of them are identified as US citizens. So again, this is not something that's happening somewhere else. It is happening here. And those victims are part of the United States. They are citizens. They are our children. They are our neighbors. They are our nieces. They're everyone that we love and care about. And again, sex trafficking victims are more likely to be African-American in terms of compared to their white counterparts. So 40% we're seeing compared to 26% for whites. Most of the confirmed suspects are male. 81% are male, whereas about 19% are female. And so females do participate as traffickers. Usually they themselves have been trafficked and have been in the business, if you will, for a while, and are then sent out as sort of friendly, or at least in quotes, sort of friendly engagers, if you will. And their job is to identify vulnerable girls and bring them back to the sex trafficker and to engage them. And some end up, again, having their own group of girls that they exploit. But a lot of times they are the front folks for males traffickers. We're noticing that gangs are starting to get more involved in human trafficking. It's easier for them in terms versus drug trafficking. It's an ongoing commodity, meaning once you sell the drugs, they're gone. You got to go get more. But with human trafficking, you can use that same victim over and over and over again. And so again, there is a huge influx of gangs getting involved in human trafficking. And another very scary, disheartening, concerning statistic is that more than 60% of confirmed sex trafficking suspects are African-American males. So what we're finding is that there's a very, very high percentage of identified sexual trafficking victims that are African-American girls, and even also a significantly high number of identified trafficking suspects are African-American men. And there are a number of reasons, and we'll talk about why that is. So a study that was done by Los Angeles County Probation Department, just looking at their numbers, found that of 174 underage cases that they looked at, about 84% of those girls were from poor communities. In the southeast communities of Los Angeles County, nearly 60% of them had been in the child welfare system, and 92% were African-American. Again, there's many factors in that statement that we will sort of deconstruct in a bit. There are strong connections between trafficking, poverty, migration, gender, racism, and racial discrimination, which again, we will talk a little more in detail about. It's important to keep in mind as I started this very conversation about trafficking, human trafficking, is that it is part of the fabric of American society. Racism is deeply embedded in human trafficking. This UCLA law review that came out in 2015 goes a lot into detail about the relationship between the discrimination, slavery, racism, and all those issues, and how they have contributed to the to human trafficking, and in particular sex trafficking of people of color. We know that race and racism have played a role in creating this epidemic, and again tends to hinder good interventions, both legally and policy responses, because we don't want to deal with the racism issue of it. We want to go out and rescue folks, but we don't want to deal with the systemic racism or the institutional issues that hold up sex trafficking and benefit many, many people around that. And we also know that colorism can play a part in the Black community around sex trafficking, and that a lot of times, due to how folks feel about themselves, they may engage in different types of high-risk behaviors that that again can be related to their skin color. There was a study that found that persons of color, they looked at Hispanic and African American, expressed forms of maltreatment, emotional maltreatment by their families due to the color of their skin. And so again, the more these traumas, the adverse childhood experiences, the greater vulnerability we create in children, and the greater likelihood that they will be exploited later on. And so this colorism issue, light versus dark-skinned individuals, again, they internalize that, and it contributes to their further victimization based on the color of their skin. So again, we want to make sure that we are addressing those issues. And again, those flow directly from issues of racism. So these are some of the key risk factors for child sexual exploitation. And so we're going to talk about different factors in each of these spheres. So societal risk factors, again, not recognizing what this is, not acknowledging sexual exploitation and trafficking. The overall sexualization of children, which is ridiculously rampant right now. The lack of resources, racism, structural violence that happens at a societal level. All of those are issues that have risk factors to create these vulnerabilities for traffickers to exploit later on. And then we have community risk factors, peer pressure, social norms, and we'll talk about some of those examples, gang involvement, under-resourced schools, under-resourced neighborhoods and communities that can no longer protect the residents. And so therefore they put them at greater risk and increase their vulnerabilities, because these communities have been so disinvested in that it is hard for them to, again, protect their members. And so these factors combine together to create these vulnerabilities that set the stage for sex trafficking. We also have these relationship factors where, you know, as was mentioned earlier, families have been disintegrated, if you will, or not provided the resources to protect its members. And so family conflict, disruption, abuse within families. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about adverse childhood experiences that happen in the family that can contribute to sexual exploitation of children. And then we have, again, these individual factors. Any kind of past history of trauma creates a vulnerability in the person. Their own status, are they homeless? Are they throwaway kids? Are they runaway kids? And again, we see that a lot with LGBTQ youth who end up being trafficked. Again, have they been in the system? Have they been in the juvenile system? Again, we see more kids are in foster care. We see more children coming out of those systems that have internalized this sort of negative valuation of themselves that make them more vulnerable to being exploited. And again, stigma and discrimination that they have, again, internalized in their own lives that put them at greater risk for exploitation. So I want to talk a minute about the sexual objectification of Black girls and boys and how it relates to sex trafficking. It's important to step back and sort of look at what are the psychological tools that are utilized in objectifying someone. And this objectification is a very important process of breaking down a person. It's kind of like this brainwashing that you may have heard people talk about. And it's a process of making a person or a group of people the objects of another's group of people or persons. It removes that victim's humanity, allows the oppressor, the abuser, the exploiter, the harmer, however you want to call them, to use them for purposes of self-gratification or servitude. And so you saw this happening with slavery as a prime example of a way that people were objectified. They were told that they had traits that were not human. They were seen as less than. And that's a really important process for both the victim and the victimizer. And it's important to recognize that the system creates and sets up these sort of dynamics that lend themselves to the exploitation. And so when you make someone an object, it's very easy to harm them. It becomes this sort of again, relationship where you have no person, you have no subjectivity, you are not human. And so if you just look back in the history of how many times and ways that that happened here in America for African Americans, you know that Black folks and around the world for Black people, that this has allowed them to be exploited, used, victimized, violated in various ways, including just direct violence. And so when we put this into the sexual domain, we look at sexual objectification, and we see this a lot just in terms of looking at for women who are, you know, the sexual being of a woman is used to sell hamburgers, cars, any other kind of commercial product. We are very good at objectifying women in that regards and sexualizing them and sexualizing children. We see a lot of young girls who are put in clothes that should only be put on an adult woman. And even then I question that. A lot of kids will internalize that and say, well, I want to look like that person that is in the music video that has no clothes on, that's running around, gyrating and doing things of a sexual nature. And we see younger and younger children being sexualized in this way. And this is also true for boys as well, where they contribute their sexuality and become commodities for sale in the marketplace. Boys are told that they need to, you know, have muscles or look a certain way or walk a certain way, that's sexually appealing. And again, we're seeing this happening at younger and younger ages. And so again, American culture has this long history of over-sexualizing Black boys and girls with sexual stereotypes. You know, girls are Jezebels, or we have the hypersexualized Black men, or we have a lot of things around the anatomy of Black men, all of these sort of things that sexualize Black men and can be very confusing if that is not who you are, or again, can be very confusing in terms of how it impacts for males, the development of masculinity. And so we have this culture that ends up being internalized and gets displayed in a lot of ways in terms of, even if we're looking at gangster rap, where there's this subculture of glorifying pimps, exploiting girls, misogyny, and things of that nature. And so what we tend to see is this glorification, if you will, of the highly sexualized Black male, which is both, which is a trap. It's a trap because, again, men have to live up to that, that image that's very hard. There are studies that have shown that Black males are portrayed as hypersexual and untrustworthy. 64% of teens feel that media sends this message that it's okay for Black males to cheat in relationships. So all of those sort of messages play a role in the development of a masculine identity that lends itself to sexual exploitation, either as a victim or as a victimizer. And so the sexual exploitation contributes to sexual sexual objectification contributes to sexual exploitation, trafficking, and feelings of traumatization. And so the process of sexualizing, the process of sexually objectifying someone is a traumatizing process. When someone takes your humanity away, when someone takes away who you are, when someone else controls that narrative, and the person isn't controlling it, but society is controlling it, it creates a traumatic response in that person. They feel powerless, which is one of the core dynamics related to trauma, is these issues of powerlessness, lack of control. And so again, we want to keep that in mind as we start to look at why we're seeing such high numbers of Blacks involved in sex trafficking. And so we have these risk factors. Again, we talk about it at a societal level, community level, familial level, as well as individual level. And so what we have for Black males is this lack of opportunity. And so because they don't have the same playing field, they have limited economic avenues for mastery and self-esteem, because we are in this systemic racism that automatically cuts off other avenues except the ones that society allows you to excel in. And so capitalism is seen as the hustle, things that we have to do to get by, because we are not allowed to have those regular avenues that are relegated to the privileged, to the dominant culture. We have to either fight through that or come up with other ways. And so you see that for a lot of Black men, they are hustlers. They have to be. It is a survival technique. It is not necessarily a negative thing. It shows ingenuity. It shows industrialness, if you will. And again, it's something to be applauded. But because of racism, you're only allowed so many avenues to do that and to show that. And so again, it becomes the hustle of how am I going to make it in life? And then we have masculinity that holds men accountable for having to provide for their families. In a patriarchal society, if a man is not providing for his family, he is not a man. And then that has assaults on their self-esteem. And so the persona of the pimp is rooted in white supremacist discourse that denied, again, African-American men legitimate venues for economic status. Well, you're not going to be able to be a banker, but you can be a pimp. I remember there was this thing going around for a while where people were doing this sort of 70s party themes, and a lot of people were doing these pimp and hoe parties. I was appalled. I said, there is no way I would ever go to anything like that. And then when I started talking about where that all came from, folks are like, ooh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, let's think about it that way. Why are we participating in this? Again, internalized. We have this implicit bias. We are not consciously aware that we are engaging in racist stereotypes, or that we have bought into the racist narrative for African Americans or Black people. Again, America values and prioritizes economic success over other aspects of personhood. So if you are not making big money, then there's something wrong with you. And again, your self-esteem is shot. And so the pimp as a hustler can be regarded as this African-American adaptation to success in America. That becomes who we're looking to. And again, we also see that in the white community as well, in terms of I'm trying to think of the name of the movie now, where they were doing the stock market and how they were exploiting people in that regards. But again, we don't get the same notoriety. Those folks are saying, oh, they're geniuses. And then we look at folks that are doing the same thing in African, oh, they're criminals. And so again, there's always this sort of discourse that makes the narrative around Black folks negative in any way that we can. Also, we need to look at toxic masculinity, sort of the Mac Daddy, super macho gangster type of person, as someone who has a lot of power in the community. And again, this traumatic experiences lends folks to feeling powerless. And so being able to gain that power, we will do that however we can. That's a natural way of being. And so people will go after that. And a lot of times this toxic masculinity that is a product of a patriarchal society sets the stage for misogynistic understanding of women, oppression of women, exploiting women, because again, it's power at any cost. It is success at any cost. And so this sort of capitalism connected with toxic masculinity sets the stage for exploitation. And again, we see this adoption or internalization of the pimp persona with a lot of Black males who end up being sex traffickers, because again, all other avenues of gaining self-esteem have been cut off by the system except these. And we are, again, all of us are driven to excel. That is part of human nature. And so you will do what you need to do in order to survive. And so this rich, powerful, smart, countercultural hero is developed. And those of you who are old enough to remember what have been called now, looking backward, as Black exploitation movies, as you know, a lot of the heroes were pimps or gangsters or people who were making it in spite of, but utilizing criminal avenues to do that. And so unlike the player whose game was to achieve sexual access to as many women as possible, the pimp's game was to extract as many resources as possible from a girlfriend or for someone else. And again, a clearly exploitative narrative. As Snoop Dogg says, a hoe is done until she is all hoed out. A player can be played out, but pimp is for life. And so that kind of mentality permeates a lot of sex traffickers, and that, you know, I'm going to get mine and I'm better than. And again, you can even hear the misogynistic attitude that is incorporated into that statement. And another thing that happens is that our Black males are over policed. You know, they sneeze and the police are right there, ready to, unfortunately, kill them, shoot them, arrest them. And so one of the reasons why we do have such high numbers of Black males in prison is this over policing, this hyper surveillance. Again, there is high crime in a lot of Black communities that sort of set the stage for that over surveillance, but there's also over surveillance even when there isn't high levels of crime. And that, you know, now we're hearing a lot more conversations around what it means to defund the police and transform police departments so that they're not just so focused on surveilling Black folks. Because again, if you're looking for crime, if you're going to watch Black folks all the time, yeah, you're going to find something. And so again, this need to control this group in ways, I can't tell you how many Black men I've talked to who just talk about how they get pulled over for no reason, how they get over surveilled, how have they entered. For those of you that are not from Los Angeles, you know, LA is seen as a land where there's so much diversity, but there's also a lot of hidden racism, segregation, de facto segregation, if you will, in terms of housing and things of that nature that contribute to, again, this over control, this toxic environment, this creating of trauma in the lives of Black people. And then many times, because of this hyper surveillance or over surveillance, our boys are misidentified as perpetrators and not seen as victims. And again, those who end up in sex trafficking, we need to start understanding their victimhood, and that these are ways that they are trying to survive a lot of the trauma that they have been put upon them at times. And so one of the things that, you know, as we talked about, this is about, I'm using this trauma lens to talk about sex trafficking. There are other ways to talk about it. There's other issues related to it, but I come at it again because my background as a psychotherapist, in particular a child therapist, looks at how trauma impacts the lives of children and then how they grow up and how that trauma impacts all of that. And so understanding trauma is not just about getting the knowledge about what trauma is and what it isn't. It's also about changing the way you view the world. When you understand the impact that trauma has on child development, has on individuals and how they act, you tend to become more compassionate and think about a cause different. And so our problem solving changes when we truly understand trauma. We aren't going out to arrest everyone because they're involved in sex trafficking. let's try and look at ways that we can provide treatment and support, because again, folks are there due to trauma, due to multiple traumas coming at them in multiple ways, and we'll talk about that. It's about changing the helping paradigm from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. And that's a huge shift, because a lot of times helpers come in, oh, there's something wrong with you, you're not good enough, whatever, let me help you, let me fix you. As opposed to understanding that something happened to this person. There's nothing wrong with them. They were doing fine up until this traumatic event hit them in their lives and knocked them for a loop. And now they're just trying to do the best they can in terms of recovery. And sometimes we do that in healthy ways, and sometimes we do that in unhealthy ways, or not as healthy ways. And so we want to look at always asking that question, what happened to you, to help us to understand why we're seeing the behaviors, why we're seeing folks engage in unhealthy or high risk behaviors, as opposed to, oh, that person is just bad, or that person is just evil. They're, you know, and again, I understand the context in which I'm here. And so understand what I mean when I'm talking about evil is that I do not believe that anyone is truly evil. I believe that evil things happen to people, and that causes people to respond in ways that are not healthy for them. And then they could engage in some of these acts that are seen as evil as a way of becoming empowered again in their own lives. But I inherently don't see that in my heart of hearts, that there's anybody who is evil. And so we have these adverse childhood experiences that I've sort of mentioned. And these are experiences that happen during childhood that create what we call childhood trauma. And they can be things such as growing up in a home where there's domestic violence, a home where there's untreated mental illness of the parents, or untreated substance abuse, or poverty, or growing up in communities where there's high levels of violence. All of these sort of things, or growing up in a home where you're being abused, either physically, emotionally, or mentally. All of these are issues that contribute to what we talk about in terms of trauma for individuals. Let's see here, let's catch up with myself here on my notes. And so this ACE, what we call the ACE study, was originally done in San Diego through Kaiser. About 17,000 Kaiser patients took part, and they were asked as adults to look back at their lives before they turned 18 to tell if any of these types of events or experiences happened to them. And it was found that more than 60% and almost 70% reported that they had at least one of these sort of adverse childhood experiences. And about 50% reported that they had anywhere from 2 to 3 and even more. And because the Kaiser study wasn't very diverse, it had mostly white, middle class, college educated folks. We wanted to see, well, how does this play out in a more diverse group of folks, either ethnically or class in terms of their social economic status. And so Philadelphia then did an ACE study, but they also looked at not just what happened in the home, but what happened in the community. Were you ever in foster care? Did you ever feel that you were discriminated against? Were you witnessing community violence? And so they looked at those issues and found in their largely ethnic minority community or population, where they looked at a majority of people of color, that the numbers were even higher for ACEs. And so now we know, just based on all the studies that have been done across the country over the past decades, that for African Americans and people of color, that they have higher rates of ACEs. They have higher rates of adversity in childhood. So poverty, racism, neighborhood violence, all compounded the original findings of the ACE study. Again, including more types, bullying, foster care, all of those sort of things contribute. And we see high rates of that in communities that are of color, and Black communities in particular. Black adults were more likely to have 4 or more ACEs compared to white adults. And so it was discovered that where you live matters. And again, this has to do with segregation, this sort of de facto segregation, because again, you'll not find it on the books, but it's still on the books in some places in Los Angeles, FYI, where you are not allowed to live because of the color of your skin, or whites were not allowed to sell their homes to people of color, and in particular Black folks. And we have, you know, just hearing more and more about sundown towns where when the sun goes down, you better not be out. And so this sort of relegated people of color, and in particular Black folks, to certain parts of town that were disinvested in, again, compounding the poverty and the lack of powerness, yeah. The lack of being empowered, I guess, would be a better way of putting it. And so your zip code has one of the greatest determinations of your developmental trajectory. So where you live matters. And if you live in a community of color, with poverty, it's going to be a bigger struggle for you than it is if you did not live there. And so there are different types of trauma that I'm going to briefly touch on, just so you can get a sense of all the trauma that impact upon our Black children. So we have historical trauma, which is trauma based on what happened to us in past generations. It is passed down through generations. It is passed down not just through the stories of past abuse, but also embedded in the DNA. So now we know, and again, if you're interested in understanding historical trauma, I would encourage you to look up epigenetics, which is the study of gene expression. And so we know that trauma, because it's such a powerful force in lives, that it will embed itself. And so this is done, these studies, were done with Holocaust survivors who may not have even talked to their grandparents or great-grandparents at this point about their Holocaust stories, but found that they had certain markers in their DNA makeup that held on to these memories of trauma and impacted their lives today. They tended to have higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, and again, without listening to the stories or without even being impacted by parenting from folks who survived. So again, this is why we now know that there is a biological component to trauma. And then there's intergenerational trauma, which is pretty much, again, the same sort of mechanism in that trauma travels across generations. Historical trauma is focused on groups of people, ethnic groups, cultural groups, whereas intergenerational trauma is about individuals within families. And so we know that these types of traumas, both historical and intergenerational, travel down through generations over and over and over again, unless there's some intervention. It's been stated that trauma will travel up to 8 generations, whereas even alcohol and substance abuse will only go up to about 4 generations. So a very, very powerful factor in terms of development is trauma. And so that's why we are really focusing a lot on the impact of trauma on children, on lives of people. So again, if you grew up in a family where your grandfather committed suicide, you find that there are a lot of members in the family that then use suicide as an approach to solving problems. Again, even if they don't even know about it. We see incarceration that goes across generations. I had one little boy that I was working with, 14-year-old, who thought he was going to be in prison the rest of his life. That was his family story. Everyone in his family, we did a family tree, and pretty much cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents, parents. His father was incarcerated for life due to murder. And so he felt that this was going to happen to him, and there was nothing that he could do about it. And so we just started to unpack some of that. So all of these sort of situations can be, again, passed on through generations. And then we talk about racial trauma, which again is just starting to get more information about these days, because again, we're looking at racial trauma and its relationship to maternal health and high rates of Black infant mortality. But racial trauma is a term used to describe the physical and psychological symptoms that people of color often experience after exposure to particularly stressful experiences of racism. And so these acts can be both overt and covert, and can again include a lot of psychosomatic, I don't want to say psychosomatic, but physiological responses or biological responses. such as hypervigilance. We see stomach aches, complaints of pain, problem sleeping, self-blame. All of these sort of things are connected to, again, racial trauma. And let me speed up here. I see I'm running behind. And then we also have community trauma, and the impact of this trauma extends beyond just the individuals, but also looks at the community and disempowers the community to protect its residents. And so we need to operate not just at an individual level, you know, as we looked at those spheres of risk factors, but also at a community level. What are we going to do to support that community so it can protect its members, so that it can hold them up and help them to survive and have a better life? Because again, community trauma is real. And so again, all of these different types of traumas come together in a way that we talk about as intersectionality, where all these things meet can create these oppressions that create trauma. So where all these intersections happens tends to be multiple traumas. And again, trauma tends to dominate the lives of people who, if we look at it from an intersectional perspective, because of all their different identities. So if you're a woman, if you are LGBTQ woman, if you are a Black woman, if you are a poor woman, if you are a single mother, if you are a Black man, if you are a Black boy growing up in a poor community, all of these types of identities that you carry come together to create a huge amount of trauma in the lives. We know that trauma can impact Black masculinity, impact any masculinity, but in this case, we're talking about Black. And so there was a recent study that found that Black men tend to develop their masculinity model based on the amount of adversity and trauma they experienced in childhood. So elevated levels of adversity, socioeconomic instability can create these changes in masculinity from a respect-based masculinity, which values characteristics like hard work, education, things of that nature, and replace it with reputational based masculinity. Again, we have to have some kind of masculinity model, and either it's going to be respectful or it's going to be reputation. And reputation is where we're, we the baddest person there. I may not have anything, but I'm bad regardless. I'm self-reliant, I'm aggressive. I engage in sexual promiscuity, again, as a value system for masculinity. And so these are just some of the responses that you might see with African Americans to historical enduring trauma, which is the type of trauma that impacts most of us here in America as Black folks. So we might see an increase in aggression, vigilance, and suspiciousness. So again, this sort of healthy, what we would call healthy paranoia. Increased sensitivity to threat. We tend to see threat everywhere. These are the folks that you accidentally bump into them and they want to fight you because you did it intentionally. And so for them, it's about survival. And there's no room in that narrative for accidents. You intentionally did something. And again, it's about survival. And whenever you feel threatened, you're going to do whatever it takes to survive. And so again, it's an important piece to keep in mind as we're working with folks. And then again, this increase in psychological and physiological symptoms, more health-related issues, hypertension, cancer, diabetes, all of these physiological responses to stress and trauma, alcohol use, drug use, a narrowing sense of time, and all of this. And so what we're asking is that we become trauma informed, that we get trauma informed in our communities, that we recognize that trauma is pervasive, that most people have had some trauma in their life, and that we need to acknowledge that we need to say that out loud. I remember I went to a church to do a presentation on the sexual abuse of children, and many of the people in that church, many of the Black men in that church, stood up and said, you know what? It happened to me too. And for many of them, they had never acknowledged that sexual abuse happened. And part of my job was to say, I am sorry that you went through that. Society needs to apologize to victims of this type of trauma and abuse because we don't acknowledge it. And that makes it even harder for folks to do better. Trauma-informed practices says, we're not judgmental. I'm not here to judge you. I understand why you do what you do. I understand the impact that trauma has had on your life. And I am sorry that you've had to go through that. And that we try and understand that human beings always need to feel safe and heard. And that in order to, and for them to do that makes a significant personal change in their lives, when they feel safe, when they feel protected. And so even for those Black boys who are identified as sex traffickers, they are victims of a trauma-inducing environment that placed them in that role. Yes, they have responsibility for their behaviors, but I need to understand where that comes from. I need to understand what happened to them so that I can help them in a way that doesn't continue to devalue them, but lifts them up in a way that doesn't blame them, but understands them. And so again, some ways to promote recovery and resilience. We don't blame the victim. We explain how you got there. We help connect the dots. And so as individuals, as churches, as community organizations, as programs, we want to make sure that we don't inadvertently blame the victim for what's going on in their lives. We can hold them accountable. We can help them to understand about taking responsibility, but I'm not blaming you. And that's a very important thing. We need to be empathetic. We need to be validating. We need to legitimize their experiences of oppression and trauma. We need to talk about it. We need to provide these spaces for young men and boys to tell their stories, however that works. It could be on a basketball court with men just shooting hoops, talking about, yeah, this is what I went through, building those bonds and attachment. We want to always speak the truth, especially the power about racial, historical, enduring trauma. We don't want to not talk about it. We want to put it out front. And this is the impact of racism, is that it creates racial trauma, that it changes the development of our children. It changes our physiology. It kills us. And we need to start speaking the truth about that. We want to help survivors develop a new meaning about their trauma. How do we help them to repurpose? Everyone has to have a purpose in life. How do you take that trauma history and turn that into your purpose? Okay. We want to teach some coping skills. So again, if you are wanting to start a program around helping boys in general so that they don't end up in this developmental trajectory toward prison or what have you, then let's teach them how to cope with the fact that there's been trauma in their lives. Teach breathing. One of the easiest things to teach that helps to calm the body. We want to talk about movement. You know, we like to dance, we like to move. Include that in our trauma narrative. It's about how we use that. And so you see a lot of boys, a lot of Black children engaging in dance, and that movement creates a shift in the body in terms of trauma. We want to teach problem solving. One of the things that trauma does is disconnects you from the prefrontal cortex of your brain. And so you can't think, you tend to be in a fog most of the time. And so how do we work to do that and empower people around that? We work in collaborations. We are respectful. We give choices. We work to enrich the community. And then we want to make sure that we are supporting the community. What kind of things are we doing in that community to make it a better place? Because ultimately the community is what's going to hold and help heal the individual members of that community. What cultural practices can we use that will help us? What spiritual practices? Again, spirituality is a great way of helping people to find purpose in their lives. How do we help them to embrace that part of it? And then how do we build resilience in our Black boys? Again, resilience is the ability to cope with change. We may not ever do away with racism completely. We definitely want to put a dent in it, a really big dent, but it's always going to be here. And so how do we then build up our community, build up our boys in order to address that? We educate them, we teach them to recognize racism. This is racism. This is not you. This is racism. And we have those conversations that can start. Those conversations can start at about 2.5. Children recognize racism. They don't have the words for it, but they recognize what it feels like. We need to start having those conversations as early as possible and help them to build the skills to have resilience, but also to resist the impact of oppression. So again, remember, activism is the antidote to powerlessness, meaning that we need to get involved. It doesn't mean that we all march down the street with a sign. It might mean that I vote a certain way. It might mean that I reach out to my neighbors. It might mean that I join in activities that are uplifting to the community. It might be that I share my knowledge with folks. Whatever it is you need to do, that's what we do. Because again, as Paulo Freire speaks, the greatest humanistic and historical task of the oppressed is to liberate ourselves. We are going to be the heroes that we are waiting for. And so the more we do to support ourselves around that, the better it's going to be for our children as well as our boys. So if you have any questions or you want this PowerPoint, I can give it to Susan or Ken or whoever, but feel free, take a picture of the screen, and you can always email me if you have any other questions or comments or concerns. And so I know I kind of went over a little bit, so hopefully we have some time to answer questions, and I will stop the share.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'd like to thank you, Dr. Ingram. Awesome. And let me say, Dr. Ingram, if you have the time, I'll make the time, because I mean, what you gave us was outstanding. And at this time, we're going to open it up for questions. Ken, if you'd like to say something before that, feel free. But this time we'd like to open up for questions, and you can use the raise hand to ask Dr. Ingram questions. And Dr. Ingram, I tell you, I cannot put in words how pleased I am and how empowered and enlightened by your presentation. God bless you.
Thank you.
So any questions, anyone? You'll just go ahead and raise your hand, use your hand reaction button. If there's any question, because we'll do about 10 minutes or so of that.
Yes, Dr. Ingram, Hilda Wills, Louisiana, Knights Peter Claver and Associates, Sister of the Blessed Sacrament. We work with various communities, and in the South, I was in particular, where would we find the human trafficking concentration, I guess I want to say, not necessarily only there, but, you know, someone answered me everywhere. I realized that, but in particular, truck stops, highways, what does that look like in the South? And I appreciate you, and of course, social workers rock, because I'm one.
Hey.
God bless you. And thank you.
You're welcome. Again, I think the answer everywhere is an important answer to hear, because where you think it is, it may not be there in the same kind of a way. It looks different in different places. It's in schools. It's not just at truck stops and those sort of places that we know. We've got folks that are recruiting kids out of school. We got kids that are being exploited while in school. We got folks that are online being exploited. So yeah, it's everywhere, and we want to look for it everywhere, not just sort of say that it only happens in certain places. It happens everywhere. And again, I think one of the things to really keep in mind is how sexual exploitation happens online. Even before COVID, we were seeing an increase in sexual exploitation through the internet as a recruiting tool. So we definitely want to make sure that we are on top of what our children are seeing and being engaged in online, because many of our kids are especially during COVID, were so isolated that that made them even more vulnerable to online exploitation. And we saw an increase, and are seeing an increase in online sexual exploitation of children. So again, I don't want us to not deal with the physical part in terms of people who are out on the street. I think that's just a very, one picture that we see is kind of like the homeless. We always focus on the homeless that are on the street. But if you look at the whole issue of homelessness, there are multiple places that you're going to find homeless, sleeping on couches in people's homes, et cetera. And so I think it's the same for sex trafficking. And again, I would want to really caution us to not narrow our understanding of where it exists, but to broaden it and really look at online platforms and how it is used to exploit children. And again, it may not be this sort of formal, here's a pimp with a whole bunch of women that are working for him. It could be a woman who is connecting young girls with other folks. It could be a man. So it's not just the pimp that's doing all this. So again, we need to broaden our understanding of what it can look like and where it can exist.
Dr. Ingram.
Karen, who knows a lot more about this than me.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Dr. Ingram, my name is Armand King. I believe we're connected in so many ways, but I've never heard you speak before. And as that former trafficker, as that black man you talking about, you're the best speaker I've ever heard, with hundreds of conferences, hundreds of so-called experts. You are dead on everything you're saying, and I just appreciate you. I can't wait to talk to you myself. I'm over here texting my whole squad, survivors, care advocates, case man. I'm texting everybody. Like, if they don't get on this right now, because it just feels so good, because usually it's just me and maybe my little circle that's saying exactly what you're saying, and we have to convince people of this, but you're articulating it so well. And to be a doctor and understand this, and a sister, you are spot on. And I just appreciate you so much. And if the man, thank you. That's all. I don't even have a question. You know all the, you got the answers. You're speaking my language. You're speaking for my friends that aren't here to speak for themselves, that are incarcerated, that are targeted, males and women. Thank you. That's it. Keep going. And I just can't wait to connect with you offline out of here. And I need this recording, because this needs to be taught. You know, I need this. Everybody needs to hear what you just said today and present it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is Susan. I'd just like to say that because a lot of people are putting in the chat that they want access to this presentation, that it's beyond awesome, which is exactly what Armin said. And everyone who registered will get the link to the video, because I've been recording this, and you can send that link out to everyone so that people can share it and like that. So I just want to make sure everyone knew that.
Awesome. Okay, guys. Well, I guess, Reverend Bowie, do you want to go into the discussion? Oh, you're muted.
If all the questions have been asked, we'll go into discussion. But if you have a question, feel free. We don't want to deny you the questions at this time, if you have any questions. Okay. Being none, Ken, take us into discussion.
I got muted some kind of way. Okay. All right. Well, anyway, I just want to say, Dr. Ingram, of course, thank you so much. I think this is the second time hearing this presentation, and each time, when I say it gets more and more relevant as time going, unfortunately. But it's so important, because as we talk about, you hit on so many deep rooted issues, that if we're going to make progress, if we're going to have this healing, if we're going to end this thing, we've got to hit it head on and be detailed and specific like that. And, I'm huge on cultural competency, and I know that you are. And as the National Black Faith Coalition, you're so appropriate, because you understand the spiritual aspect, and you also understand the importance of cultural competency and how we must talk about this white elephant in the room. And this is why we don't progress, because no one wants to talk about the oppression, because the good-hearted people, like all of us on here and many out there, we don't think that way naturally. So we kind of want to act like everything's okay. But the statistics and the reality is showing that everything is not okay. And so we have to, I think the reason why there's a movement, yes, the National Black Faith Coalition for All New People, any victim, survivor gets sent to us, we're going to try to help. We don't care if you're red, black, white, green, blue, because we are serious about this issue. However, we're saying that there's a very important reason for us to focus on the Black community as Black people, right? And you see Susan on here, you see a lot of other non-Black folks, so you don't have to be Black to be involved in this. The only thing we want to always be clear is that this is a faith-based coalition. This is not a task force. This is not a 501c3 government. This is a faith-based, and we want to use the power of the church in this aspect. Now, many of us are tied to other agencies and government agencies, and so we have that to also offer as resources. So anyway, I just want to say thank you so much for that. And I think as we lead into the discussion, the main thing I want to focus on is just to talk about some of the signs. Like, one of the things you said is that, the things, how to focus and empower these young Black boys, how to prepare them. That's the prevention part. Because everyone on this call today, you guys are advocates. As she ended, her last slide talked about activism. All of you are activists, whether you see yourself as that or not. That's why you're on here, because something in your spirit said, I need to learn. I need to be a part of this. There's a reason why you're on here today. And so you may know that already, and you may not. But what she said about empowering them, figure out you know, if it's not you yourself, who around you? Is that a pastor in your church? Is that a youth ministry in your church? Is that a community organization in your neighborhood that you could focus on Black boys and use some of this material and education that you have to take that out to them, to figure out how can we utilize this? Even if there was a lot, okay? There was a lot of great stuff in here. So I think you can, when you get this thing, you can break this thing down and compartmentalize it. But just think about that as we go into the discussion. What do you have around you in your sphere, in your field of influence, in your power that you can start you helping and heal a community with the things that you learned here today? So be thinking about that as we go into the discussion, and we'll have Reverend Bowie, if you don't mind, lead that discussion.
Who would like to speak first?
And let's make sure we don't talk, if we could, since we are open now, let's try. I know it's tough because we're on Zoom, but let's try to make sure we hear one person at a time and not try to let someone finish their thought before we kind of chime in. But if you want to use the raise hand reaction, go ahead and do that, because that will actually help Reverend Bowie, because he could visually see who has a question and who's next, that kind of thing. So just make sure. Okay, thanks.
This is Susan. I actually have a question for Dr. Ingram. Maybe you can, whatever, is in terms of my understanding of trauma and my understanding of this issue, if the perpetrators want to get out, they need to see that they can get a job, that they can make it financially, not just the minimum wage job. We know that. So what I've been told is that, and Dr. Ingram pointed this out, is that your brain's kind of in a fog when you've been traumatized. But what about doing jobs that are kinesthetic, hands-on, like being an electrician, something that does pay? Could they learn something like that because it's kinesthetic?
Yeah, I mean, people, again, I don't want it to seem like folks are that this is a throwaway community just because you've been traumatized. What happens in the brain is that trauma truncates, but doesn't completely shut down the brain.
Right.
Basically, what I'm saying is that there is healing all along the way, and you just want to engage in healing practices. Not everybody has to go to therapy, but I think, again, if you're feeling stuck and you can't move forward, therapy is a great way to help you get unstuck. But again, as a community, there are things that we can do to help people in healing. One is just listen. Listen to what folks got to say, validate them. Yes, I understand. Yes, I believe you. Many folks who've been sexually abused run into people that don't want to believe that it happened. And that's the worst thing you can do in helping someone to recover, is not to believe them.
Yes.
Awesome. And
Dr. Ingram, this is, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Who is this?
Hi, this is Jennifer Holman. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Dr. Ingram, I'm so super impressed with all your information. It's amazing. I live in Houston, Texas, and I want to certainly invite you down. So I will, Armand King has been down. So he knows some of the collaborations we have down here. So eventually I want to invite you down, but I have two things. One is, I think the information that you're shared lays it out so well that I believe that the white community needs to understand. They will not understand a lot of that historical trauma that you teach, which is extremely important and has to be definitely messaged to the white community so we can understand how to either support and then help with that type of historical trauma and not re-traumatize. That's my first comment. So I would love to have you down to Texas, and I will fund that. The second thing I would like to say is, just recently, and I want your feedback on this, is we recently in Texas, thank God, just changed the age from 18 to 21 to work in sexually oriented businesses, because we know that cognitive behaviors between the age of 18 and 20 are not yet mature enough to understand the risks and the ramifications of what happens in strip clubs. However, when going down that path in the state of Texas and trying to get the faith-based community involved, some of the feedback I got from very influential Black pastors from large Black communities was, what about jobs? Where are these girls going to go work? And the bus boys and the other people that work there. And the other one is some of them who they believed it was more choice, and they come to their churches. And so how do we support that community? So it was an interesting dichotomy, because I know that works and jobs, and that's something we absolutely have to continue to support and provide for young Black males and females. But how do we change that understanding that strip clubs are also sexual trauma, and engage the Black faith community in helping us change some of these laws so that we can protect those and not have them re-exploited?
Yeah,
I know that was long, but I'd love to hear how you feel about that, Dr. Ingram.
Again, it's complicated. I will say that, because I know there is a movement to legitimize sex workers, and to make sure that they receive the same protections as any other industry. And I have very mixed feelings about that. And again, I'm not necessarily coming at that from a moral place. I'm coming at that from a trauma place. And so what I say is that the vast majority of people who are working in that industry are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So I always want to then tell people, what does that mean in terms of freedom of choice? When 90+% of the people who are working in that industry are survivors, and that means that they were victims. Is it really a true choice that they're making, or is it they're playing out that trauma narrative, and therefore they are trapped? And so I believe that everyone should be protected by the law, regardless of what you do. But I would want to work on how do we help folks make that transition. And I'll give you an example, not so much about that, but just in general about how we view work here. It's kind of hysterical in some ways, but tragic in many ways. People are complaining, employers are complaining that they cannot find people to fill jobs right now because people are getting more money being unemployed because of the federal subsidies around unemployment insurance. And so the cry is, let's cut them off of that unemployment and make them go back to work. Well, let's reframe that. How do we make employment more attractive to folks, because we're paying them a sub living wage? They get about, I think right now it's estimated at $15 to $16 an hour equivalent if you are getting unemployment insurance. And so you are blaming the victim when you say, well, you should drop that and go back to work for $6 or $7 an hour. We need to have a minimum wage. We need to have a living wage that is a national piece that says we will all make no less than $15 an hour. And actually that doesn't even help you much in Los Angeles.
Right.
But when you look across the nation, that is a huge increase in the minimum wage. And so if you're paying people a living wage where they can survive, they will come to work. People do not want to sit around and not do anything. People want to work, but they don't want to work for less money. They can't make it. They can't survive off of that. And so let's change that national discourse around how we're going to deal with unemployment, and maybe take that unemployment money and subsidize their wages so that they can work. It's a different way of looking at it. And so I think those are the issues that I talk about, even in terms of people working in the adult industry, the adult entertainment industry. How do we, you make more money stripping than you do as an administrative assistant. That's kind of weird. And then how you then come back and tell someone that, all right, give up that money, come work for this, and you'll be better off. I think we have to do both. It's not one or the other. We have to encourage people that, these are reactions to your trauma. And again, I don't know people that work in that industry that have not been, that are not survivors. And then again, they get trapped in that because then they got to do drugs and alcohol to allow someone to touch them. And then that creates another, what we call social disparity and health disparity. And so it becomes a vicious cycle. But we can't just go in there and say, give up the money and learn to live for less than. If we truly value people, then we need to pay people a living wage. That's my
Dr. Ingram, I totally agree. And I'll tell you that in Texas, we did, it's called the SMART Act. And if you look me up on Facebook, you can see what our NGOs, our community all stepped up to pass that bill. And we're now creating a solution called Smart Options that we're collaborating with our NGO experts, some of them on this call, to do that. I would love to meet with you again, though, and meet with some of our advocates here and NGOs to discuss what you think is a good approach as well, as we have some good experts as well. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to share piggyback off of that too and answer because there was like two-part question. So one is, what do we do as far as, getting them to work? Well, you have to think of, like, for instance, when I talk about the advocacy and knowing what is in your community is so, so important. But, there's so many issues. So you have to kind of figure out, zone in on something, that you want to kind of focus on. And if it's employment, like right now, and as all my LA people know, I'm new in Houston here, loving it, but I still love you guys. And so anyway, with the work that I'm doing with the Code Black, it's all centered around Black males, 12 to 17, 18 to 24, two separate divisions because they're different places in life. And a lot of these things, that's what the curriculum is talking about, like the historical trauma and taking them to even understand what does trauma look like, those things. So that takes care of the healing, like Dr. Ingram is saying. But while we're doing that, they still have to survive. So we have a financial piece where we're teaching them understanding basic things very early, like bank accounts and money management and budgeting, and what is the difference between life insurance, health insurance, things like that. But also now working with folks in the community to help give them some volunteer opportunities. And if they're old enough, give them some internships, even in high school, to start getting their mind around it as they're healing. Then you have, I took a contract job, which I don't know why I did that, it's crazy, but I took a contract job until September here in Houston with San Jacinto College. Now, if anyone knows, that is the #1 junior college in all of Texas. They have great programs. They get a lot of government funding, but they're also all around the United States. And so one of their programs, the one I'm a project manager over, is the Health and Science Department. And you have to qualify by being low income, meeting the 150% poverty income. Most of our survivors that they qualify on SNAP, some type of benefits, homeless, unemployment. There's multiple ways to acquire. This grant is 100% free that they don't pay for, right? All the books, they get a laptop, right? And they get case management through that time. And they're working with workforce to ensure that they get a job in the program. Now, there's CNA, phlebotomy, EKG, they can get multiple certifications in this. But what I'm saying, in programs like that, we have the opportunity now to start helping them heal and aspire to be more. But there are other programs out there, but see, you have to kind of just zone in and focus. My mission is, is that, and what we're here doing with Alive, we're focusing on strictly the Black community and what are those areas? Like, we're event-based. So our thing is, we're not housing people right now. We're not doing the mental health, but we're partnering with people, get a Dr. Brenda Ingram to come on and educate and things of that nature and talk about something that makes sense for them. Because if I get here and talk about this national thing, that's great. But again, let's talk about the white elephant in the room. How's that going to affect these people who feel like, well, a lot of these things you're talking about, I don't get because I'm in poverty here. I'm struggling, right? The second part to this thing, and I think most important, where Dr. Ingram says complex, it's interesting. I just did a YouTube video on this about cultural competency, and the fourth aspect is the hip hop industry, the pop culture. When you have Cardi B's, right, who is the #1 female rapper right now in the world, who brags about being a stripper, who has been on reality shows about making her money and coming up that way and normalizing this. You have all these young girls, and it's not just Black, it's Latin, it's white, it's Middle Eastern, you name it. Like, wow, she's amazing, because at the same time, she is a mother and sharing her life with her beautiful baby, right? She is, in a committed relationship. She is philanthropic and giving money. So you look at that, our children are still developing mentally. They can't make sense of this. And then she's on TV getting awards and interviewed and sitting next to Ellen on the couch. But she's also, teaching our children through music that this is how use men, use your body, use sex. You have Nicki Minaj, Yo Gotti. Their song is, I tell all my hoes, rake it up. They're giving you a visual imagery of the pimping hoe game with him, with all the women with the money, and they're actually raking up money and dropping it, So our children are faced with this, and we have to, as parents, we have to talk to our kids about that. In the community, we have to educate our parents. Some parents are dancing in the car, and I'm talking about churchgoers. I know I've seen people on Instagram going to church and coming from church, listening and talking about how good the service was, but they're jamming to this music. And I'm like, are they listening to the music that is being played, those words that are being sang? Because their children are definitely listening to it, and they're singing it all over TikTok and things of that nature. So it is complex, and this is why we're fighting a beast, but we have to not be afraid to speak out and tell the truth. This whole center thing, I don't want to offend these people. I will praise Cardi B for her hustle, her grind, being someone coming from impoverished area, community, to the hood, working her way, doing what she knows to do, right, to get out. I will applaud her for that. But at the same time, I will call her out on, but what the way you're going about doing it. Now let's see how can we help do this in a better way, because you're very talented. So this is where we have to address those things, right? And it's not going to always be very popular, because you're messing with people's icons, right? But those are part of the reasons why it's so complex, because they do make a lot of money. If you talk to some of these and work in big strip clubs, they make a lot of money a year, more than people with a master's degree, sometimes even doctorate degrees. They're making, it's easy for a girl to make over 100,000 a year. And you're telling her now to go work at this office job where I don't control my time. I'm being reprimanded, because they don't like how I dress, how I look, or how I work. And I'm making these pennies and now I'm struggling to pay bills. So it's that mentality. But once we get their mindset right and they value themselves more, then we can start. So the healing has to take place at the same time where we're making sure we're providing needs. Because if you're not taking care of needs, I'm sorry, I cannot focus if I can't feed myself. I cannot really focus on this if I need to eat. I need to have somewhere to sleep. So those are the things that we have to address together. They have to be together. They cannot be separate. So anyway, I just wanted to share that part.
Yeah. Yes, this is Pastor Bowie. Let me say that is why there's such a great need for the National Black Faith Coalition. Part of the challenge that we face is the silence of the faith community. Reason why many of these ills exist is because many of the faith communities who have principles in which they suppose to live by, but are not speaking out or stepping out. And this is part of the National Black Faith Coalition to get the faith community involved. That, like, it was nice that they raised the age to 18, but guess what? No one's daughter should be in that industry.
Right.
And what we do is when we create industries like that, we legitimize them.
Right.
And what happens, we end up in many ways victimizing the victim all over again. Now, we may not end the strip industry, but I believe that as the church, number one, and as we've done today, we've educated people. So we've got to educate people. And this is part of the National Black Faith Coalition, as we have done today, and raising the consciousness and the awareness, as Dr. Ingram has done such a great job of doing today. And this is part of why we're coming together. And it can't be done alone. It's not just the faith community by itself, but the faith community plays an important role because we have principles that we live by that should not be compromised, that will give a better compass of a moral and ethic compass to live our lives by. We live in a very immoral, or even we're going to a place of amoral society. So the National Black Faith Coalition is moving this agenda forward. Also, one of the things that I agree with Dr. Ingram that we got to understand, part of the reason why this exists is economics, the lack thereof and the lack thereof opportunity for African Americans, which creates an environment for this type of business of human trafficking to thrive. Because what happens if a man is hungry or a woman is hungry, it's easy for them to compromise what their values are because they want to be fed and need to be fed. I'll end right there.
Judith?
Hello?
Hello.
All right, hello.
Hi. My name is Bernice Knopflin, and
I thought you called, didn't you call on me?
Oh, and I'm sorry, I did, Judith. I saw your hand. I didn't see Bernice. That's okay. Bernice, go ahead. And then Judith will have you go in after.
Thank you. Yes, I'm the outreach coordinator here in LA at my church, which is Mount Tabor Missionary Baptist Church. And every Wednesday for the past 3 years, we outreach to people experiencing homelessness. But one of the phenomenons that I like the doctor to speak to that I see, because when I'm out there, I encounter a lot of our young girls who are sex trafficking. And I noticed, I've been really trying to figure out why a lot of the ladies that are out sex trafficking, I noticed that they do it right in front of churches, and on site you might think, well, how disrespectful. But then I kind of came up with something else. I think that, and I'm not sure, I have no facts. I think that a lot of them will sex traffic right in front of our churches as a way of, feeling safe or protected. And Dr. Ingram, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think I worked for the YWCA in Compton, and many of the ladies who were trafficked, and I say trafficked versus our trafficking, were in front of our building because it was a safe place. And they many times ran into our building when things didn't go well. And we always kept an eye out on them for them. And we provided coffee and donuts and all kinds of stuff. So I think safety is another piece. But from a business lens, it's where the customers are. And so I know that might not sound like something anybody wants to say or hear, but I think you need to also look at that as a potential issue, that the people who are buying are not, folks in raincoats hanging out in dark alleys. They are regular, upstanding citizens, if you will. And so I think we need to take those factors into account as well. Yes, I think safety is one, but I also, from a business perspective, you go where the customers are. And that doesn't mean that everybody in church is coming out and buying sex. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that we need to recognize that there are dual relationships in a lot of areas. And so you may have someone who's saying, carrying their Bible and hanging out with other folks. So again, for me, it's not just a moral issue, it's all of those pieces combined. And that's why this is such a complicated and complex issue that requires multiple ways of impacting it. And so we have to look at the economics, we have to look at the spiritual world, we have to look at the healing approaches, we have to look at trauma, we have to look at all these pieces that contribute to this phenomena of sex trafficking, and figure out what are our interventions going to be in all of those areas, because one size does not fit all. And so we want to take all of that into account.
And let me just say, and then I'll finish. I encountered a young lady one day when we were packing up from our outreach event. And so I put together some things I had left, like water and PPEs and, anything that I could provide. And I walked up to the corner and I approached her, and, she got a little startled because she didn't see me coming. And I said, hello, how you doing? My name is Bernice. And I just wanted to come and see if you need anything. And of course, I was quite taken because when I looked at her in her face, I knew she was really young and really, you could see some wholesomeness there. So I thought maybe she's new to this. But one of the things that I'm still trying to figure that out, because when I engaged her, I had her walk back over to where my car was. And I said to her, we're here every Wednesday. And if you're out here and you need help, and I explained to her the different resources that we provided. And she looked at me and she says, well, do you guys have any housing? And, I said, I have some information in the car, come with me. And she looked at herself and I said, anytime, you can come over anytime. And she said, well, I saw you guys, but I didn't. And she looked down and I could tell she had a certain amount of shame. And she said, I just didn't want to walk over looking like this. And so, of course, I said to her, God says, come. And, and she finished the statement for me before I could get the rest of it out. She said, come as you are. I said, absolutely. And that's why I asked the question. I said, from the victim's point of view, I'm seeing these young ladies in front of churches. And I say, is there something spiritually that says to them that I will be protected in front of the Lord's house? That even if it isn't real, that's because that's what I was looking at.
Bernice, I don't want to take too much time because we have time is precious.
Ahead.
I think
Go
that
ahead.
Dr. Ingram, so let allow some of the other people the opportunity.
No problem.
Thank you, but thank you for your input.
Yes.
Okay.
Judith?
Okay, I just wanted to comment on the healing practices, because I think that that's really something that can help with the trauma, and it can be very simple, and to start early with students who are coming out of those environments that have been identified where trauma could have happened, and to have it as part of the schools and in education, where starting as early as preschool, students start working to heal their trauma with those healing practices that would come from relaxation, learning how to breathe, teaching kids how to do that very early to get those wellness practices as part of their lifestyle so they can start healing the brain. So they can, that will help to make make healthier choices, I'm trying to say, as they grow older, and they won't find themselves falling into patterns that have maybe been a part of their background. So learning how to breathe. You could teach a little preschoolers to learn how to breathe, to learn how to sit and relax. They're so cute. They can learn how to do that really early and develop those practices that they carry on up through their life. I think that can be very helpful as making those changes where they won't find themselves, going into, the prison system, or, being trafficked or being a trafficker, as we were talking about for boys. One other thing I had wanted to mention as well, as I teach high school, and I'm a health teacher, and one of the things is part of the curriculum are the media messages. And you mentioned that, Mr. Henry, Pastor Henry, the media messages are just so strong, and those mixed messages that are coming in from the media like that is very powerful. It's very powerful. And I think that education, teenagers really need to be aware of those messages that are coming out there and their effects. So, and which you talked about that also, Dr. Ingram. So that was pretty much it. Oh, another thing too I wanted to mention was about approaching people on the street who have been trafficked, who are obviously being trafficked. Since I am interested in this field, I went to the Berkeley School of Theology, and there was another colleague of mine who actually was finishing up her MDiv. She actually got her MDiv, and this was one of her main areas for her dissertation was human trafficking. And the first thing she said was, even if, like, say, like in Oakland, over on International Boulevard, you see people out there, you know that you suspect that they've been trafficking, or she said it's not safe to go up to them at that point, to approach them, because their pimps are nearby and they're always being watched. And that if anything is threatening at that point, if the pimp finds or thinks that they're going to be identified, the girls could really get hurt really, really bad. So I just wanted to get your comment on that.
Yeah, and I think it's true that for vulnerable populations that are on the street, you do want to be cautious, not only for their safety, but for your own, because you don't know where someone is in their journey. And so again, it's a population that is highly traumatized, and that means they are very suspicious. They feel threat at every turn. And so you don't want to sort of approach folks, but make yourself approachable. So what you can do is be someone that hands out food. This is a practice that is done a lot in when people go into the street homeless communities or homelessness communities, is to start with food. And so that is one way of starting to build the relationship, and that, and showing up and being consistent. So having you know, every day you're out there handing out food or some sort of sustenance of some kind. We the Association of Black Social Workers in Los Angeles, we did a warm clothing drive, and we're just there, and people can come and get warm clothes and things of that nature. And so making sure that you provide these sort of supportive approaches without a message attached to it necessarily, that we're just here to provide that support. Helps a long way in building the trust, because you know, these folks have learned that I can't trust people in power. They have betrayed me, they have hurt me, and so just providing that substance, and like I said, it could be food, it could be clothing, it could be anything that they need without necessarily having another message attached to that, is very helpful when you're working with populations that have these high levels of trauma. And so again, it's about them approaching you versus you approaching them, and them approaching you because you are approachable. So I think that would be something to keep in mind, is how am I appearing approachable? And folks will seek you out. They always do. And again, don't expect, oh, I give you a sandwich one day and then you're coming with me the next. It don't work that way. It might take months. It might even take years of being that approachable person, that safe person in that community who is not asking anything. Again, we have a group of people who've been exploited all the time. And so their first thing is that, what do you want from me? And so again, it's giving without wanting, it's giving for just support, it's giving to be there, and it's being approachable.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to share too on that, a practical, because it's very important for you guys to have that. So for instance, like, and this is real life, real time reality, that first of all, my suggestion is, if you're really interested in doing street outreach too, find out what agencies are around you that are actually doing that, they have experience doing that, because then you can join forces with them, and then any responsible agency, which I hope they're all doing that, will always do a training for anyone who's new that's coming in, whether you are community, church-based, whatever that may be. Now, Pamela Bryan is on here, and she is the executive director for Restoration Diversion Services, which in Compton, California, which I'm a board member of. And, you know, if Pam wants to speak on this, she can, but many of the outreaches that we've done, even with Restoration Diversion Services, and, you know, it's right on the track, like their drop-in center since right on the track. So we would get groups together, you know, my agency would come, a Pam agency, and we'd have some church folks come from various churches, and we would get people in the groups. But then we would have a training, about a 30-minute training before, for all new folks. But beforehand, you know, we would educate them on appropriate dress and things of that nature, because that plays a role as well, you know, especially if you're going to be young girls coming out there, and have enough male presence. And then how the males, we wouldn't allow males to engage, but just to be with each group of women, right? And so we were all doing it as a faith-based approach. So although we had little care packages to give to them, which had condoms, which had sanitizer, which had things like that, we also would make, you know, the goal was just to ask if they wanted prayer, right? Some girls would say yes and allow, some girls would say no. Some girls would avoid you because the danger that that is prevalent there is where sometimes the traffickers are watching. They're either driving around to make sure they're still working, or they're sitting in a parking lot somewhere. And a lot of times you can tell from the girl looking, if she sees you and she kind of anticipates or suspects you being some outreach group that's going to try to engage her, and she knows she'll be in trouble, she'll try to avoid you. She'll get away from you. She'll go off the street. Sometimes she'll go by the car where he is and just kind of wait until you pass. And then you leave, she'll come back. So there's ways to do it, but I say that if you haven't done it before, the best practice is get with groups that are skilled and experienced in doing it, and let them train you, and then go out, because they know the safety precautions. Like we've always let the Compton sheriffs, who worked really well with us, know, hey, we're going to be out here from this time to this time. They know not to be there watching, because, you know, girls won't talk to, but they know to patrol the area and just kind of make sure. So I would say that if you or whoever is interested, get with the organization that's doing it.
Yes.
I was just going to add.
Go ahead, Dr. Ingram. We're getting close. I'll hear from you. Go ahead.
Okay, just real quick, just also to add that let's not forget about online, because that's how a lot of folks now are doing this trafficking, is through online chat rooms and things of that nature. So start looking at how we can interrupt that process online. One thing that happened for, I think it was the National Center for Sexually Exploited Children, was really targeting Pornhub. Pornhub, am I saying it right? Pornhub. And really went and Pornhub was like, well, you know, people are entitled to put up whatever they want to put up, blah, 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 blah. One of the most common types of pornography that you see in Pornhub is exploitation of children. And in particular, incestuous relationships, the most common requested type of porn videos. And so a lot of those folks are underage. And so what they did is that they went after Visa and MasterCard, who people use to join those websites, to pay for those videos. You know, even though a lot of them are free, feel that that's an issue. So again, the main again, the folks that are on the streets are just a small percentage of the ones that are involved in this trafficking, and that trafficking has really moved to online. And so recognizing how to intervene in that is going to be really important. It has a much broader span of addressing this issue if we can get to the online trafficking that's going on. And you'll see now, and again, having watched this for 30 years or so, I have seen that the ladies, it has changed beyond the fact that they're much younger than what they used to be on the stroll. They are also all on their cell phones. And so a lot of that is they're doing these things online and meeting up with people and making these locations. And so they're not necessarily going to be the ones that are just, you know, walking the stroll as it used to be. Now online, those sort of cyber techniques are dominating the field of sexual trafficking. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
Thank you. Well, it is 10 o'clock, and I want to respect your time, but if you'd like to continue this discussion, you can contact us and we can continue this discussion. Not only that, the National Black Faith Coalition will continue to bring quality people to you, such as Dr. Ingram and others, and on different subjects, because you see that there's a great deal of education that's needed. And that's one of the areas that we can help, education and training. So I don't want to keep you too long because I want to respect your time. I don't know what you're doing, but please contact us, and you can contact us through the National Coalition Against Human Trafficking. Please email. And those of you who may not be involved, please send us your email and see how we can work together. Although we are the National Black Faith Coalition, and faith is very important, it's not limited. We realize that we cannot do this on our own, and that this must be approached and remedied through a holistic standpoint. So I don't want you to think that we only are locked in only to faith, but the faith community, and which is the most powerful and influential institution within the Black community. So that's why we are in this fight, and that's where a great deal of our power comes from. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out. I'd like to close in a word of prayer. Susan, is there anything you'd like to say before I close out? Ken?
No, just that I'm going to keep the chat open for 15 minutes. If people want to exchange contact information, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah,
outstanding. I just want to thank Brenda, Dr. Ingram. We have to have you back. You are beyond phenomenal.
Ken, anything?
No, I just thank everyone. That Dr. Brenda, she knows how I feel about her. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And everybody for being here. That's it.
And I'm going to put my email in the chat, so if people want, they can always email me.
Yes. And the National Black Faith Coalition Against Human Trafficking, want to thank each and every one of you for coming out. And activism, you've got to get involved. You got to get involved if we're going to make a difference. Okay. Let me close in prayer. And I want to thank the National Black Faith Coalition, all of the members and involved for the outstanding job that you're doing. It's teamwork. Yes. You're hearing from me, but it's a team, and teamwork makes the dream work. Let me pray out. Most gracious and loving God, we thank you for these few moments that we have, and thank you so much for Dr. Ingram and what she has brought to all of us today. And as we leave here, hopefully all of us have left empowered. And if we want to be more empowered, Lord, that we will come together, get in contact with us as we work together to end human trafficking, wherever it may be. And Lord, I ask that you would bless each and every one of us, strengthen us, encourage us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.